Snow does not fall evenly on a hillside. It never has. On most of the ridge above the valley, the drifts that winter piled up past a man's knee, burying fence posts, burying the tops of wagon wheels left out too long. But on one part of that same hillside, where the rock folded back on itself into a shallow hollow, the snow melted first. Not all at once. Not in a way anyone could explain standing at a distance. It simply thinned faster there than anywhere else on the ridge, as though something underneath it were still awake. Neighbors passing on the low road noticed it before they understood why they were noticing it at all. They also noticed the smoke, a thin, steady line of it, rising from a place that one season earlier had held nothing but bare rock and a hole no deeper than a root cellar. No one had built a cabin there. No lumber had been hauled up that slope. And yet smoke was rising, morning after morning, from a hillside that had been declared, by more than one man in the valley, unfit for anything but goats. The widow who lived there had buried her husband the previous spring. She had also been told, more than once and by more than one person, that the land she'd been left with was worthless. Too much stone, too little soil, a slope too steep to plow, and too shallow to build on properly. A hollow in the rock that old-timers called, without much affection, the cave. By the time the first hard frost came, most of the valley had stopped speculating about what she would do. They assumed they already knew. What they did not expect, what none of them were prepared to explain to each other when the subject came up at the mill or after church, was a home. Not a shelter thrown together out of desperation. Not a hole a family huddled in until something better came along. A home. Warm in places where warmth made no obvious sense. Dry in places where the whole hillside wept water after a hard rain. The story of how that happened did not begin with a plan. It began with a woman on her knees in the dirt, running her fingers along a cold stone wall, trying to figure out where she was going to keep a winter's worth of food when she had no shelves, no lumber, and no one left to build them for her. She was not thinking about heat that day. She had no idea, yet, that the rock itself was about to tell her something the rest of the valley had never bothered to ask it. Her name was Ingrid Halvorsen, and by the time the leaves turned that autumn, she had been a widow for 6 months. Her husband, Eric, had come west with her 3 years earlier on the promise of good soil and a fair claim. He had died in the spring, thrown from a wagon on a road no worse than any other road, in an accident no one could have predicted and no one could undo. What he left her was a boy not yet 5 years old, a name that still belonged to both of them, and 40 acres of land that the rest of the valley considered close to worthless. The good bottom land had gone to other families years before Ingrid and Eric ever arrived. What remained, what had been available cheap enough for a young couple with almost nothing, was a steep hillside claim. More stone than soil, with a shallow hollow carved into the rock face that the old-timers called, without much warmth, the cave. It was not a cave in any real sense. It was closer to an overhang, a recess perhaps 12 feet deep and 8 feet across, open to the weather on one side, cold and bare inside. Eric had always meant to build a proper cabin somewhere flatter on the claim. He had talked about it the way men talk about things they assume they have years to get around to. Now there were no years left for him, and the flat ground he had chosen was still just grass and surveyor stakes. Ingrid stood at the mouth of the hollow one morning in early October, her son Peter beside her, and did the kind of arithmetic that widows on the frontier were forced to do without anyone's help. She had perhaps 6 weeks before the first hard frost. She had a little money, most of it already spent on the burial. She had borrowed tools, a neighbor's ox for 1 more week, and a boy who needed to eat through a winter that showed every sign of coming early and staying long. She did not have lumber for a cabin. She did not have the coin to buy it, or the labor to raise one alone, even if she did. What she had was the hollow in the rock, and whatever it could be made to hold. At the mill that week, when her name came up, more than one man in the valley shook his head, in the particular way that meant they had already decided how her story would end. A widow, alone, on a claim nobody else had wanted in the first place. It was, they agreed, a hard thing to watch, and an easier thing to predict. Ingrid heard about the shaking heads secondhand, the way most people hear the things said about them. She did not answer it with an argument. She answered it that same week by walking back up the hillside with a borrowed chisel and a mallet and beginning to work the stone. The chisel had not been Ingrid's to begin with. It was Eric's, along with the mallet, a hand plane with a chipped edge, and a folding wooden rule marked in inches that he had carried in his coat pocket since before they were married. She had almost sold the tools that summer. A trader passing through had offered her a fair price, enough for a month or two of flour and salt pork. And for one long evening she had sat with the offer in her hand, turning it over the way she turned over most decisions that year, alone at the table, after Peter was asleep. She had not sold them. It was not sentiment alone that stopped her, though there was sentiment in it. It was the plain fact that a chisel, a mallet, and a folding rule were tools a person could still use to make something, and a month of flour was a month of flour, and then it was gone. Her sister-in-law had written twice that summer, offering a spare room in town, an easier winter company for Peter. It was a kind offer, and Ingrid understood exactly what accepting it would mean. It would mean giving up the claim, or at least giving up any pretense of holding it herself. It would mean becoming, for however long it took to get back on her feet, a guest in someone else's house, eating at someone else's table, raising her son under someone else's rules. She wrote back a polite letter thanking her sister-in-law, and did not accept. What was left, after the funeral, after the letters, after the trader's offer had come and gone, was the land, the hollow in the rock, the boy, and Eric's folding rule, which she now kept in her own coat pocket the way he once had. She did not know yet what she meant to build. She only knew what she needed before the frost came. A dry place to keep food through the winter, a place the mice and the damp could not easily reach, and shelves, since she had no lumber to spare for shelves, that would somehow have to come from somewhere else. Looking at the bare stone wall at the back of the hollow, she began, for the first time, to wonder whether somewhere else could simply mean the wall itself. The first mark Ingrid made on the rock was not ambitious. It was a shallow groove, no more than 4 inches deep, cut into a soft seam of stone at roughly waist height, meant to hold nothing more than a row of jars. She had noticed, working the wall those first mornings, that the stone was not uniform. Some of it resisted the chisel entirely, hard and gray and unwilling. Other sections gave way in thin, chalky layers, softer than she expected, closer in feel to packed clay than to granite. It was in these softer seams that she began cutting her shelves, working an hour or two at a time between the chores that still needed doing, the wood that still needed splitting, the boy who still needed watching. Peter, for his part, found the work more interesting than frightening. He collected the loose chips of stone in an old flour sack and lined them up outside the hollow by size, a game of his own invention that kept him near her while she worked. By the end of the first week, there were 3 shallow shelves cut into the back wall, each one just deep enough to hold jars of preserved vegetables without them tipping forward. It was not, in Ingrid's mind, the beginning of a house. It was a solution to a smaller, more immediate problem. She had food to store and no lumber to build the shelves that would normally hold it. What she noticed, almost as an afterthought, was that the stone dust from the softer seams packed down hard once it was tamped, almost like the clay floors she remembered from her childhood in the old country, floors that had kept homes there dry and warm for longer than anyone in this valley had been alive. She did not think much of the observation at the time. She was tired, her hands were raw from the chisel, and the frost was still coming whether she noticed clay-like dust or not. But she swept the loose stone dust into a corner rather than out the front of the hollow, and that small, almost unconscious choice, made without any plan behind it, would turn out to matter more than anything else she did that week. Everett Cole had ranched the section below Ingrid's claim for 11 years, and he was not a man who enjoyed being wrong about the land. He knew the valley's frosts, its flash floods, its stretches of drought, better than most. And he had built his own house twice, once wrong and once right, before he understood the difference. He rode up the hillside on a cold afternoon in late October, ostensibly to return a borrowed ox, and found Ingrid on her knees at the mouth of the hollow, chisel in hand, stone dust in her hair. He did not laugh at her. That much needs to be said plainly, because it would have been easy to laugh, and he did not. What he did was worse, in its way, because it was reasonable. He told her that rock held moisture, especially rock cut into a hillside with no drainage below it. He told her that stale, unmoving air inside a stone hollow could turn sour and thick in a way that open cabins did not, and that more than one dugout in the valley had been abandoned after a family found their bedding damp and their lungs troubled by spring. He told her, not unkindly, that a hollow was a fine place to store root vegetables and a poor place to raise a child through a hard winter. He suggested, as her sister-in-law had, that she consider town. He offered, if it came to it, to help her sell the claim to a rancher 2 valleys over who had been buying up marginal land all season. Ingrid listened to all of it without arguing. She did not tell him he was wrong, because she did not yet know that he was. She had cut 3 shelves into a stone wall, and noticed that the dust from one seam packed differently than the dust from another. That was not yet an answer to anything he had said. What she told him, standing in the mouth of the hollow with the mallet still in her hand, was simply that she intended to stay through the winter and see for herself. Everett rode back down the hillside that afternoon, fairly certain he would be riding back up before the first real snow, this time to help carry a widow and a boy down to somewhere warmer. He had no way of knowing that the stone Ingrid was cutting into was about to start answering questions neither of them had thought to ask yet. The dog had been Eric's before he was anyone else's, a rough-coated animal named Skip, who had followed the wagon west and never quite forgiven the loss of the man who used to feed him from the table. Skip did not care much for the hollow. For the first 2 weeks of Ingrid's work, he lay outside it at the edge of the stone, refusing to come further in than the last patch of daylight. Ingrid assumed it was simple stubbornness, the same stubbornness that made him refuse certain trails and certain water. She had learned, over the years, not to argue with him about it. What changed her mind was the afternoon she noticed exactly where he lay. He was not avoiding the hollow itself. He was avoiding one particular section of it, the section nearest the back wall on the north side, where the stone stayed cold and faintly damp even at midday. On the opposite side, nearer the shallower southern wall, he would come in far enough to stretch out in a patch of afternoon light that fell across the stone floor, and he would stay there, sometimes for an hour, long after the sun itself had moved past the opening. Peter noticed it before his mother did, in the offhand way children notice things adults are too busy to see. He mentioned, almost as a passing complaint, that Skip always took the warm spot before he could get to it himself. Ingrid stopped what she was doing and walked to the spot her son meant. She placed her palm flat against the stone. It was not warm in any way that would have impressed a man like Everett Cole. Not the way a stove or a hearth was warm, but it held something the northern wall did not, a faint, stubborn trace of the day's sun that had not yet let go, even as the air around it had already begun to cool with the coming evening. She could not have explained that afternoon why one wall held on to warmth and the other did not. She only knew that her son's dog, with no reason to lie about it, chose one side of the hollow over the other every single day, and that the choice was not random. She began paying closer attention to which walls stayed dry, which stayed damp, which held warmth into the evening, and which lost it the moment the sun passed overhead. It was the first time she began to think of the hollow not as a single space to be cut into wherever the stone was softest, but as several different spaces, each behaving according to rules she had not yet learned to read. Encouraged by the shelves, and increasingly curious about the difference between the two sides of the hollow, Ingrid made her first real mistake in the second week of November. She decided to deepen the recess on the northern side, the same side Skip refused to lie in, reasoning that if she could push the storage space further back into the hill, she could keep her preserved food further from the cold air at the entrance. It seemed, at the time, like simple logic. Deeper meant more sheltered. More sheltered meant safer through a hard winter. 3 days into the work, her chisel broke through a thin wall of stone into a pocket she had not expected, and water began seeping steadily along the new crack, dark and cold, running down the wall she had just finished smoothing. It was not a flood. It was worse in its way, because it was patient. Within a day, the new section of wall was slick to the touch. Within 2, a metal hook she had driven into the stone to hang a lantern had already begun to show the first orange bloom of rust. That same week, hoping to warm the space and dry it out, she built a small fire near the back of the hollow, close to the new damp section, and watched in frustration as the smoke refused to rise and clear the way it did over an open fire outside. It hung instead, thick and stinging, curling back down toward the floor until she was forced to drag Peter out into the cold to breathe. Standing outside afterward, eyes watering, coughing into her sleeve, Ingrid allowed herself, for the first time since Eric's death, to wonder if Everett Cole had simply been right. Rock held moisture. Stale air turned sour. A hollow was a fine place for root vegetables and a poor place to raise a boy through a hard winter. She did not sleep well that night, turning the folding rule over and over in her coat pocket, the way she had once turned over the trader's offer for the tools themselves. Ingrid did not pick the chisel back up the next morning. Instead, for nearly a week, she did something that would have looked, to anyone passing on the low road, like she had simply given up. She sat at the mouth of the hollow for long stretches of each day, watching. She watched where the wind came from in the early morning, and where it seemed to slow and settle by afternoon. She watched the sun move across the southern wall, marking with a piece of charcoal the point it reached at midday and the point it reached an hour before dusk. She watched, after a light rain one afternoon, exactly where the water ran down the outer rock face, and noticed for the first time a faint groove worn into the stone just above the damp section she had broken into. A groove that had clearly been carrying runoff downhill for longer than she had been alive. She had cut her expansion directly across the path of that groove. She began to understand, slowly and without anyone teaching her, that the hillside had its own logic, one that existed long before she arrived and would go on existing long after she left. Water moved along certain paths, whether a person wanted it to or not. The sun warmed certain surfaces and left others in permanent shadow. Air, when it had nowhere to go, simply stayed where it was put, thick and heavy and useless. She thought, more than once that week, of her grandmother's house in the old country, a low stone building with walls nearly 2 feet thick, built into a hillside not unlike this one. She had been a child then, and had never once wondered why that house stayed warm through winters that killed livestock in the open fields nearby. It had simply always been that way. It occurred to her, sitting at the mouth of the hollow with Peter asleep against her side, that the people who built that house had likely spent their own days doing exactly what she was doing now. Watching. Waiting. Learning the hill before asking anything more of it. When Ingrid picked the chisel back up, she did not return to the northern wall. She redirected her work toward the southern side of the hollow, the side that held the afternoon warmth, the side Skip had chosen without being asked to explain himself. She reshaped the entrance itself, narrowing it slightly and angling the opening away from the direction the prevailing wind seemed to favor in the evenings, based on nothing more than a week of sitting still and paying attention. She also did something that seemed, to her, almost too simple to matter. She sloped the stone floor near the entrance very slightly downward and outward, so that any water that did find its way in would have somewhere to go besides pooling against the back wall. The change to the fire came almost by accident. Rebuilding it closer to the entrance, rather than the back of the hollow, in the reshaped southern section, she noticed that the smoke no longer hung in the air the way it had before. It rose, thin and steady, out through the narrowed opening, rather than curling back down into the space. She did not yet have words for why any of it worked. She only knew that the second test of fire did not send her and Peter coughing out into the cold, and that the stone beneath her hand, at the end of that evening, in the reshaped southern wall, held on to the fire's warmth long after the flames themselves had died down to embers. It was a small thing. Yes. It solved nothing about the winter still coming, the neighbors still doubting, or the 6 weeks that had now shrunk closer to 4. But it was the first time since Eric's death that Ingrid stood inside that hollow and felt, instead of merely enduring the cold, something that came close to being warm. The second visitor came in mid-November, and she came for a different reason entirely. Berta Lindqvist had lost her own husband 3 years earlier, in a mining accident 2 valleys over, and had rebuilt her life since then, running a small dairy operation with the help of a hired hand and a great deal of stubbornness. She had never met Ingrid properly, only heard her name mentioned at church in the tone reserved for cautionary tales, and she rode up that afternoon mostly out of curiosity, carrying a jar of preserves as an excuse. What she found was not what she expected. She found a widow with stone dust worked permanently into the creases of her hands, a boy running a small toy wagon along a smoothed section of floor, and a hollow in the rock that, while clearly unfinished, smelled of wood smoke and dry stone rather than the damp, sour air she had braced herself for. Berta said little at first. She walked the length of the space, touched the shelves cut into the back wall, and stood for a long moment near the reshaped southern entrance, where the afternoon sun still reached the floor. When she finally spoke, it was not encouragement, and it was not doubt. It was recognition. She told Ingrid, carefully, that her own grandmother back in the old country had lived in a house built half into a hillside, and that she remembered, as a small girl, being told never to build a fire against the northern wall, only the southern one, though no one in the family had ever explained why. She had assumed it was simply custom. Listening to Ingrid describe the damp pocket, the rust, the redirected smoke, she began to wonder if it had been something more than custom after all. Berta did not offer to help with the remaining work. She had her own dairy, her own hired hand, her own winter bearing down on her. But she offered something else before she left, something that mattered more in that moment than an extra pair of hands would have. She told Ingrid, plainly, that she did not think she was foolish. It was the first time since Eric's death that anyone in the valley had said so. The storm warning came sooner than anyone in the valley had planned for. A rider passed through in the last week of November with word from the pass that a heavy system was moving down out of the north faster than the season usually allowed, likely to bring the first real snow accumulation of the year within days rather than weeks. Ranchers began bringing in the last of their stock. Everett Cole, among others, made a point of riding past Ingrid's claim twice that week, slowing his horse each time, saying nothing, though his silence carried its own clear question. At the mill, the talk turned openly to what everyone assumed would happen next. A widow, a boy, an unfinished hollow in the rock, and a storm arriving early. More than one person suggested, not unkindly, that someone ought to ride up and bring her down before the roads closed. Ingrid heard about the talk this time, before it reached her second hand. Everett rode up himself 2 days before the storm was expected, and offered, plainly and without pressure, to take her and Peter into town until the weather passed. It was, in its way, a generous offer, and she understood exactly what accepting it would cost her. It would mean admitting, in front of the entire valley, that the hollow had been a mistake. It would mean packing what little they had and starting the argument about her land all over again in the spring, this time with far less patience on either side. She did not accept. She told Everett, standing again at the mouth of the hollow, chisel still in reach on the shelf behind her, that she and Peter would be staying. She thanked him for the offer and asked if it was not too much trouble whether he might check on them once the roads were passable again, after the storm had passed. Everett rode back down the hillside that afternoon without arguing further, though the set of his jaw made clear he expected to be riding back up sooner than that, and under worse circumstances. The storm arrived 2 nights later, earlier and harder than even the rider's warning had suggested. By nightfall, the wind had shifted from the steady western drift Ingrid had spent a week studying to something sharper, coming instead from the north, driving snow directly into the narrowed entrance she had shaped weeks earlier. For the first hour, the fire held steady, and the stone beneath her hand, the same southern wall Skip had always chosen, stayed warm the way it had every evening since the correction. Then, sometime past midnight, the wind found the one gap she had not accounted for, a narrow seam near the top of the entrance where her reshaping had left the stone slightly uneven, and a thin, cold current of air began cutting directly across the floor where Peter lay sleeping. Peter woke coughing, not from smoke this time, but from the sudden cold reaching him where warmth had been only an hour before. Ingrid did not panic. She had spent too many days that autumn learning to observe before acting to abandon that habit now. In the one moment it mattered most. She moved the bedding away from the gap, packed loose cloth and a folded length of hide into the uneven seam near the entrance, and fed the fire enough to push its warmth back across the floor Peter had moved to. For nearly an hour, she was not certain it would be enough. The wind outside did not weaken. The temperature outside, by the rough guess of anyone still awake in the valley that night, had likely fallen to somewhere near 10 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill a person caught without shelter in a matter of hours. But the stone held, not because it produced any heat of its own. It had none to give. What it did was slower and quieter than that. It released, through the long hours after midnight, the warmth it had been gathering all through that short, sharp fire, giving it back into the room even as the flames themselves burned low and finally out. By the time the worst of the wind passed, sometime before dawn, Peter was asleep again, and Ingrid sat awake beside him, one hand resting flat against the southern wall, feeling it still faintly, stubbornly warm. Everett Cole rode up the hillside the following morning expecting to find, at best, a difficult conversation, and at worst, something far more grim. What he found instead was smoke rising steadily from the narrowed entrance, and Ingrid outside packing snow away from the doorway with a wooden shovel, Peter beside her, wrapped warmly, entirely unharmed. He did not say much at first. He walked, as Berta had weeks before, into the hollow itself, and placed his own hand against the southern wall. He said nothing about moisture, or stale air, or collapse, because there was nothing damp to point to, and the air inside, though smoky near the fire, was nowhere near as thick as he had warned it would become. What he said instead, after a long silence, was that he had built his own house twice before getting it right, and that he supposed some lessons about a piece of land only arrived after a person had lived close enough to it, and paid close enough attention, to let the land teach them directly. Word of that first storm spread through the valley faster than Ingrid herself ever tried to spread it. She did not present the hollow as an achievement, or correct the jokes that had circulated about her that October. She simply kept living there, through that winter and the ones that followed, and let anyone curious enough to ride up and look for themselves. By the following autumn, 2 other families in the valley had begun asking her, carefully and a little sheepishly, about the difference between a northern wall and a southern one, about narrowed entrances and sloped floors, about a folding rule that still, years later, never left her coat pocket. Ingrid never claimed to have invented anything. She had only watched a hillside closely enough, at a time when she had nothing left to lose by watching, to notice what it had been quietly offering all along. The hollow in the rock was never beautiful, not in the way a proper cabin might have been. It kept no fine furniture, and its walls never lost their rough, unfinished look no matter how many winters passed. But it was warm in the right places, dry in the right places, and patient in exactly the ways that mattered most. And that, in a valley that had already decided her story's ending months before she proved otherwise, turned out to be enough. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is a reconstructed narrative inspired by frontier building practices and vernacular stonework traditions. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.